I don't know, sometimes you gotta basically stand up and get your feet going if they fall asleep or hurt for whatever reason. But that's not the point. Anyway, what does it mean to live in a post-truth moment? On one level, the ramifications are obvious. In a world where we can't even agree on basic facts, persuasion and dialogue become all but impossible. But the problem with post-truth might run even deeper. In this group's book, Surviving Autocracy, a New York staffer writer Masha Gessen argues that the collapse of a common language or a common experience of the world is essentially the death of politics as such. Politics, in Gessen's words, is an ongoing discussion about how we're going to live together tomorrow, and we can't do politics if we can't talk to one another, if we don't inhabit a shared reality. Gessen grew up in the Soviet Union and spent many years covering the ascendance of totalitarian rule in that particular country. Their coverage of Trump and Trumpism has been among the best anywhere. But this book, more than any other Trump book I've read, focuses on the corruption of language and the subsequent loss of a collective space for what we typically think of as politics now. I spoke with the person that did this article said they spoke with Gessen by phone about the relationship between language and power and why our inability to exist in the same reality is paving the way for an authoritarian government. A transcript of the conversation, lately edited for length and clarity, follows. It says Hannah Arendt, the great 20th century political theorist, had this notion of thoughtlessness, referring to the inability of people in totalitarian societies to think beyond cliches and slogans. And how do you see the problem of thoughtlessness today? When Arendt writes about totalitarian societies in particular, there's something really important that it is hard to grasp. In the last chapter of the origins of totalitarianism, she talks about the difference between tyranny and totalitarianism. She says that under tyranny, a certain set of behaviors, a certain set of statements is expected, a certain kind of performance from citizens is traded for some security that still leaves the person intact. Whereas under totalitarianism, because of terror and because terror depends on being unpredictable, you never know what is expected of you, so you can't perform totalitarianism in the same way. And this not knowing what you're supposed to give the regime in order for it to leave you alone robs the individual of the very ability to form opinions. And I think that's also at the root of this idea of thoughtlessness, because the goal of the totalitarian regime is to make it impossible to think. Robbing someone of their ability to form opinions is an interesting way to put it. Something similar happens in non-totalitarian societies, though it's even harder to detect. This is why we wanted to ask you about language. For Arendt, at least if we all know about politics comes to us via slogans and talking points and sound bites, and that doesn't just undermine how we talk about politics, it determines what's actually thinkable in the first place. Language determines what's thinkable, right? I mean, it's very hard to think a thought that you don't have a word for, but it's impossible in fact. There is a huge difference between that limitation, which is just part of the human condition, and being in an encapsulated ideological world that is divorced from the reality you can experience. And when Arendt writes about totalitarian ideology, she makes a very important point that any ideology can be totalitarian. And she writes that it is a key characteristic is that it's entirely encapsulated. It's impervious to any input from outside reality. So I think the problem with faux news, or living inside the faux news bubble, is not just the language and the framing, but it's that the language and the framing actually do not apply to your daily reality. Basically, talking to somebody the other day whose entire family has had COVID, and yet they don't believe in COVID, and that is like a perfect example of totalitarian ideology. Even if they had said that it wasn't that bad and not a lot of people are getting it, or something that acknowledged their personal experience, that would be one thing. But they literally do not think that the thing exists. They think that it's a conspiracy, which it's not. That's wild, is that sort of reality-denying ideology the precondition for actual totalitarianism. Well, you had all these great German thinkers who survived fascism in the 1930s and 40s, and they came to the U.S. in the 1950s and 60s, basically said the preconditions for fascism or totalitarianism are already in place here, but even suggesting that seemed outlandish at the time. You can't use words like fascism without getting dismissed. But look, there are really important distinctions between the country that the person spent most of my life writing about in this one, and the distinctions may not be what's important right now. Maybe what's important right now, or the similarities are important right now. The similarities, and I don't know And I don't know if 45 has that if Trump has the intellectual or organized capacity to create what they call a state terror. I do believe that he has what they call a totalitarian ideology, and he has often been able to pull a huge number of people into his encapsulated world. I guess the question is how much state terror is necessary to create a totalitarian society. It says it's not nearly as much as people think. And that's the thing. We imagine terror as something that applies pressure directly to every person in society at every living moment. Terror actually works by creating a sense of a credible threat to every person in society. And as if Trump weren't enough, COVID came along and created the sense of credible threat to every person in society. And even if Trump doesn't quite believe in COVID, I mean, the Soviet Union in the 1970s did not have the Gulag, did not even have particularly high rates of incarceration, or did not and it did not jail everybody who was differently minded, just a few people, and that was enough. Basically, that was enough to maintain the stability or uniformity of the thought, and just this sort of intellectual or moral desert. Basically, people have written about how Russia experienced this wave of truth and openness in those early years after the Soviet Empire collapsed, and how it's been rolled back so thoroughly by Putin and the strange nihilistic climate that he's helped engineer. It turns out that people can unsee and unthink true thoughts pretty easily. A few years ago, go back to when Russia, where some of the worst labor camps were, and people visited. And people were interviewed there 20 years ago. The person Basically, the person to talk about was an activist back then, and now they're a Putinist, meaning that they openly endorse Putin. And at first, we thought the person was joking when she said she was for Putin, and then she said, "I just got sick of being a minority. I wanted to vote for someone who was going to win for once." And then people are sitting there by the fire in the old camps, and she said something about how killing all these people had been necessary to prepare for the war, and that the Gulag had been necessary. And people said, "Wait a second, what the fuck are you talking about?" We recounted all the crimes and all the numbers and what people had read in the archives, and she just said, "Oh, they can write anything, and they can say anything." This was the ultimate post-truth moment. She had seen the evidence. She spent most of her life working with these documents, and yet she could just dismiss them when they were inconvenient for the story that she had decided to buy into. Connecting that back to the language, you write in the book that when someone cannot be described, it does not become a fact of shared reality, and the kind of willfulness and willful blindness you're describing is only possible when language has been corrupted or shrunken down so much that the things that we have to say simply aren't sayable or thinkable, or at least not sayable or thinkable for enough people. And that is right. Like we were saying earlier, you can't speak something that you don't have a word for, and you can't describe what's happening when the words you have been emptied of meaning. I was writing about the experience of voting in the Soviet Union, which was called something else. It was called the free expression of citizen will. But in fact, it was this experience of coercion and participation in an empty ritual. It's like if you and I went swimming together, but the whole time we were in denial about swimming and we're talking about it as though we had gone mountain climbing. And then 5 years later, we say to you, "Remember that time we went swimming, but we never called it swimming. We always called it mountain climbing, and we can't talk about it as swimming because it's still mountain climbing in the way we described it, and the way that we agreed to talk about it. But we didn't experience any mountain climbing. We were wet and cold, and our shoes were full of sand, but none of that was part of an experience that we had agreed to share. That's kind of what it was like to live in the Soviet Union, and it's a lot of it. It's a lot of what it's like to live in Trump's America, and that's the straight line from the loss of a shared reality to a totalitarian society. We can't do politics if we can't talk to one another. We can't talk politics if we don't inhabit a shared reality of it. We can't have politics if we can't agree on what we're living through, because then we can't discuss how we're going to be getting together tomorrow, which is what politics is all about. Now, that doesn't necessarily create the preconditions for totalitarianism, but I actually think that the complete elimination of politics is what authoritarianism is. Under authoritarianism, everybody goes home. They have their private lives and cook. They have their private lives. They cook dinner, bake bread, and the authoritarian individual or group accumulates money and power out of sight. So politics disappears entirely, but public safe space disappears entirely. It's like a lockdown forever. But totalitarianism is the opposite. The private space disappears and everything becomes political, but everything becomes political in the terms of the ruling ideology. So the authoritarian leader wants people to go home and tend to their daily lives. the totalitarian leader wants them out in the public space demonstrating their support for them. That this is why there's no doubt in my mind that Trump is a totalitarian style leader. If he could, he would have the whole country at a Trump Klan rally 24/7. You write in the book that the longer Trumpism lasts, the harder it will be to undergo the damage that he's done to our political language, and the real damage already done. What would it even mean to recover or even reinvent political language? I don't think that it's possible at this point to recover. We spent most of our life writing about and living in a country where language had really been damaged to what I think might be the point of total despair. Disrepair. We're not nearly that far along, and a lot of people are thinking through how to write and talk about this era in ways that are better than we've talked about in politics in the pre-Trump era. And there is some incredible writing and talking that the Trump era has produced. So I think we still have a lot of potential if we get to reverse this in November. In the 1990s, Soviet journalists had to basically reinvent journalism in their country, and will the American press have to do the same? Can they do the same? Of course, it's a great question, maybe too optimistic, because we see a huge difference between the current conditions of American journalism and what it was like for Russian journalists back in the 90s. And there are real conversations happening now about what objectivity means and what moral clarity looks like, and that's all part of a reinvention process. Right now, it's hard because things move so fast, and there is no attention span, and finding space for actual conversation is difficult. But a lot of good work is being done, and I think that we can come to some kind of renewed understanding of journalistic practice, if not an entirely new understanding on the other side of this. People say pretty clearly that our institutions won't save us, and that means our next opportunity to reverse this autocratic drift in the November election. If that goes the other way, if Trump's autocratic style is affirmed and rewarded with 4 more years, then what? Basically, I don't think we should be in the business of making predictions, but that's a really dark scenario. That may mean that we miss our only chance to reverse this autocratic attempt, and then we would move into what the Hungarian socialist Bálint Magyar calls autocratic consolidation, which essentially means that moving beyond Donald Trump would require not the change of a president, but the change of a regime. We already have such damage done to institutions, from the corruption of the Justice Department to the destruction of regulatory agencies to the dismantling of all oversight systems in the government itself, but we also have some incredible damage done to political culture and political language, as we discussed earlier. Then we would have to be real excuse me. Yeah, but we also have some incredible damage done to political culture and political language, as we discussed earlier. There will have to be real institutional repair and a total reinvention of how we think American democracy is represented institutionally. I take all of that to mean that if we move to this next stage of autocratic consolidation, we're talking about a level of challenge that almost by definition would require something like a revolution to fix or to overcome. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Random Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.